So welcome to Introduction to Theory in Public Forum specifically with me and Salman. So our first slide is about just who we are. Um, we have 7 TOC bids, we've called to Nats, and we are really big fans of theory. Salman, do you have anything to add?
Um, yeah, yeah, theory, dope.
We love theory. We're big fans. We used to read a lot of frivolous theory back in our day, but nowadays we kind of are a little bit chiller about it. And so next, whoa. Okay, so what is theory? So essentially, theory is a debate about debate, and so it's talking about general arguments and more so practices rather than how debate operates. And so it's about whether or not we should paraphrase, disclose our arguments on the wiki, provide trigger warnings, and more things like that. And it's generally talking about norms in debate. And so none of these things are going to be like they're going to hunt you down and you're going to lose the debate automatically, unless it's like a big evidence ethics issue and you're just like straight up clipping or lying. But generally, it's more about how we enter debates and how we present our arguments and how we conduct ourselves. And generally, teams will read theory when someone else does something bad that they consider to be abusive or skewing the debate. So when people like don't disclose, they'll say, "Oh, you're skewing me out of this debate because you had, let's say, like 30 minutes to wrap up my argument, whereas I had no time," which creates a time skew in the round. And so generally, it's just about things being unfair. And a big takeaway about theory generally is that it's not about what you do because people will read like paraphrasing theory on you for reading one card and write like changing one sentence and bracketing in one thing. But it's not about what you do, it's about what you justify. And so by bracketing in that one line, that kind of creates this norm where people are able to like change the grammar and change what the card says. And so even if you think that the violation you've done is small, it's more about the broader idea of like what that means in the context of debate. Awesome. Salman, do you want to go over the general parts of the shell?
Yeah, dope. So the first part is like the interpretation. Kind of like earlier, the interpretation is essentially like like it's like what you say are like good practices. So like if I think a good practice is like disclosing that all the evidence you read in the round to the PF wiki, like your interpretation of debate is that all teams should disclose their like positions they've read. The violation is essentially saying like what your opponents did not do. So like the violation with this for this would be like they did not disclose, and then you would be like a lot of times people say like screenshots prove or something. So the
Mhm.
second point is standards. Standards are essentially like the warranting of your evidence. So like if in a normal contention, you have a link, standards are essentially the link of your theory shell. They're explaining like why what you say your interpretation is, why that interpretation is good. So like for example, in like a disclosure round, people will be like evidence ethics. Like it's way easier to hide abuses in your evidence if you don't disclose because it means we don't have pre-round time to check. Um Voters are essentially like you can to make this analogy more towards like a regular contention, you can kind of think of them as your like internal links, but they're essentially saying like what is the big thing the judge should be thinking about in this round. So like often like we'll go further into this, but like oftentimes voters are things like education, like that you should be thinking about education as a voter in this round. Paradigm issues are essentially saying like how the judge should like interpret these things in the round. So like what the judge should like what the terminal impact of the theory shell should be, and like procedurally how the theory should work.
Mhm. Yeah. And so next we're going to talk about what your interpretation should be. And so, like we were previously saying, it's how it should be, right? And a lot of interpretations will be really specific. And so, a good example of that would be all debaters have to disclose on the 2024 to 2025 Public Forum Open Case List Wiki under the name and correct entry at the tournament, like all evidence they've read in previous rounds, right? Because you want it to be so specific that other people aren't able to easily squirrel out of it. And so a lot of times debaters, if your like interpretation isn't super specific, they will make arguments that, "Oh, I didn't violate this because you didn't say I had to disclose under my name or you said something different." And so generally it's really important to have a specifically worded theory shell so that you don't have like Bad things. These examples aren't very good, but generally, like some of these can be good. Like I'd say teams, oh, whoops. Teams shouldn't paraphrase probably is good because it kind of is just more general and kind of covers everything. And yeah, I'd say generally try to make it a little more specific. I know with trigger warnings, a lot of the times people will say teams should read trigger warnings if they are talking about graphic impacts and providing descriptions of those things. And so being very specific allows you to have a better interpretation and to kind of like not leave it up to other people's interpretation, even though it is because it's your interpretation. It's what you think the normal in debate should be. But it should be clear and easy to understand so that teams know what they should do in the future. Mhm,
Oh,
mhm,
oh yeah. Also on the interpretation, another reason why you should make your interpretation like airtight and not leave it open to anything else is because a lot of times debates can get very messy into like what you meant the interpretation to be, and so you get into like a text of the interpretation versus like this they say like the spirit of the interpretation. So just to avoid these debates, it's the best practice to like if be on the side of the interpretation being wordy rather than being very vague.
mhm. Yeah. Even if it takes you like 30 seconds to read, like it's still better to have a wordier interpretation as opposed to like really vague and no one knows what you're talking about. And so the next thing, this is in my opinion the most important part of the shell. It's the violation. And this is like where this can make or break a debate round because if your violation is not super specific, then they can just kick the shell because they can just say, "Oh, we didn't violate because you can't prove that we have read evidence in a previous round and that there's any rounds to disclose," right? Like it has to be so airtight and just hard to get around. And so I know that certain teams, when you have like a disclosure round, they'll go and they'll screenshot the fact that your wiki doesn't have any rounds uploaded because you want it to be absolutely certain that you are violating that interp. Because honestly, I think it's kind of just a bad thing if judges are voting off of like interps that they're not even sure you violated. And so making sure it's super specific is good, especially when it comes to like evidence issues or like paraphrasing. Having a solid example of a time where you did paraphrase, and even better if like your opponent misconstrued something and you're able to point that out in the violation, that's really good. Like I know we've had a theory round where we lost a round because we didn't have a URL on one card and the violation was just like so specific that it like called us out for this one URL violation and we lost the round on it. Like when the violation is specific, it is so much easier to like pin your opponents like and say, "Hey, you have not done this. You are going to lose the round for this." So, yeah, making sure your violation is specific and clear is a very good practice. Mm.
Yeah, no, one second. Sorry, I was just answering something in chat. Okay,
Oh, sorry.
cool. Yeah. We can go on to
So the next slide is about standards. And so, Salman, do you want
oh
to?
yeah, cool. I can do this.
You're
So
good.
yeah, like before, standards are kind of just like the warranting in your shell. It's like why, like standards are usually like the meat of the shell. They're explaining like your um why your model of debate is good. Usually this will be like the longest part of the shell, and there'll be like in a lot of shells there are multiple standards. So some standards here, like these are standards from like all types of rounds. Like for example, like libraries is sometimes a standard on like disclosure shells saying like disclosure allows like a library of evidence for future debaters to use as a research library and like stuff like that. Like evidence ethics, like I kind of in the name, it's just like what like not lying about evidence. So stuff like this. Stuff like ground is usually in a lot of like topicality debates. If your opponents aren't being topical, it forces the other team to have like infinite ground that they need to like research. So stuff like that. So oftentimes, like I said before, there are multiple standards. Usually, if you are reading theory, you should be trying to go for one standard in the back half of the debate because trying to extend it, like trying to frontline multiple standards and like backlining those further into the debate can get really messy. Whereas if you just collapse onto one standard and go for it really hard, especially in final focus, it just makes your life a lot easier, especially if the round is messy, which a lot of times theory rounds can tend to get, especially at like not super high level debates. Um,
Yeah. And another thing about standards is that standards are just kind of like what you're trying to reinforce in debate. And so when you have that interpretation and violation, like that's cool and all, but the standards are kind of like what you're trying to improve. And so if you're trying to improve evidence ethics or library, you can say that having these things is important to debate for X reasons, which are the voters. But generally, I'd say standards, like Salman said, are the most important part. And there are a lot of like very niche standards on the wiki if you go on and you look. Like these are just very generic ones like library evidence ethics, clash, ground, prep skew, time skew, those kinds of things, very, very general. But if you're reading a spell that's like specifically like, oh, you have to have like an exportable model of debate, you can be very specific and make like exportability a standard because you want to be able to, if you're having like critical argumentation, be able to have a in like real life model for what that looks like. And so depending on the interpretation, you should be very specific as to what standards you choose and why you want those to be like bigger in the real world, I'd say. And so then,
um,
oh yeah, Salma.
sorry. Wait, you can continue. Sorry.
No, I didn't have anything to say. You're good.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was just gonna answer some questions in chat.
Okay.
Um, so one person asked, "Is it ever okay to read theory on a lay judge?" So like, I'd say probably tend not to read theory on lay judges. A lot of lay judges, one, a lot of theory judges have like a bad conception about theory. They'll perceive theory to be like a very big, scary argument. So, and a lot of times they'll just vote like automatically against you because you're reading it.
Hmm.
Um, However, like if your opponent is being unfair, like we've read like topicality in front of a lay judge.
Have
No,
we?
yeah, me last round of Princeton.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because but like we didn't format it in a shell. We kind of just like walked them through why being topical is important and stuff like that. So like it doesn't necessarily need to be a shell, but like if the violation is so egregious that like even to any lay person it's very obvious that it's a bad thing to do, you can read it, but I just be careful. Another person just asked about cross pollination. Cross pollination is a standard on like most disclosure shells, just saying that like by putting different arguments on the wiki, you allow debaters to like essentially like use the best parts of different arguments to make new arguments and like better link evidence and stuff like that, and that just allows better, more educational debates with deeper levels of research.
I'd also say that it can be okay to read theory on a lay judge. Like I've read no evidence theory on a lay judge.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
because I truly like it really depends on how open-minded this lay judge is. And so if they are really willing to hear you out on something, then it can be okay. But just understanding like the vibe of the judge and being able to understand paradigms and like know what they're going to think of your theory shell is really important. And I also think it's like okay to talk to your judge before a round and be like, how do you know if they're okay with it? Okay, so a lot of judges will say no prog, like no theory at all. And they're going to be the ones that like on face value just like push it away. But I'd say if you have a tech judge, it's they probably have a section about theory in their paradigm, which makes it a little easier to understand how comfortable they are with it. I'd say like with a super technical judge, you can kind of read anything, but with a like more maybe they debated in high school for a few years and like kind of understand the concept of theory, maybe like stick to like disclosure paraphrasing. But generally, most people will be okay with it if it's like in good faith. I'd say. Like if you're reading it with good intentions and you're like genuinely, I think you did a bad thing, you should lose this round. Like I think people will be like, okay, yeah, like I'll hear you out. But most lay judges have heard from their like children, like, oh, you don't want to evaluate theory or case. But like if their child like debates theory, they're like, I'd say they're a little more likely to be okay with evaluating it. I don't know how to explain this. Like this is just something I've observed. Um, yeah. Okay, so next we have voters. So this,
Aiden. This is Dashko and Lennon, the
um,
PF goat.
yes, this is Tash Gilroy Lennon. We'd advise looking at his LD Wiki, St. Luke's DG on the LD Wiki if you want to have some good voters. He reads a lot of good shells
I,
if you want to borrow some. Um, but yeah, voters are what I would consider they're what you're voting on the shell. And so like a lot of times I'll debate teams and they'll forget to extend a voter and I get so excited because then you don't have any offense. Like same with drop the debater and voters. Like if you don't extend a voter or an offensive reason to vote for you, then the shell just becomes like a defensive reason to dislike the other team. But I'd say voters are another really important part of the shell because they're like genuinely what your judge like knows that they are improving when they vote for you. And so the big two are fairness and education. You hear these all the time. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not fairness is a voter because like what even is fairness? Um, but generally, this set tends to be more persuasive for like a lay judge, I'd say. Well, not a lay judge, but like a very, very like PF oriented judge is gonna like fairness more. But I'd say education is probably the biggest voter. In very specific instances, safety is a good voter. I'd say in like trigger warning theory rounds, safety is a good voter because genuinely it can be hard to debate rounds if someone has read a very graphic impact and not giving you a warning. I'll say that like straight up. Safety can be a voter in specific rounds. Oftentimes, people will inflate safety if they read it as a voter, which I think is probably fair to do because if it's an unsafe round, you can't really vote for someone and say, "Oh, you were skewed out of the round, like you literally felt unsafe." Like I feel like that's kind of the biggest voter if it's on a shell. But evidence ethics is one too, and so like you should lose for having bad evidence there. But yeah, voters tend to be less diverse than standards, but there are a lot of them and a lot of reasons people should lose debates. Mhm.
That's like paradigm shift. Oh no. Right, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. Paradigm. So I know someone asked about like
Mhm.
our like RBIs and like stuff like that. Okay, cool. Paradigm issues like mainly deal with like how your judge interprets the shell, and like what they should be thinking about the theory debate. So usually there are three, like people will sometimes like read paradigm issues as a separate part of the shell, or like they'll say like underview or something like that. Um, we will. I think we'll talk about Fifth theory later. I think
Mhm.
there's like a section where we talk about it kind of. So drop the debater is essentially like it's like it's if you again think about it as like any other argument, it's the terminalized impact of it. It's just saying like your judge should drop the debaters for doing this bad practice. And oftentimes the argue like there's sometimes two arguments about this. One is that it determines the direction of the activity. If theory is a debate about like a model of how people should act in round, dropping people provides an incentive for them to have better practices in the future. The second argument, this is usually comes up in like topicality or like disclosure or paraphrasing debates, um, and even like um trigger warning debates about like remedying the advantage your opponents had. Um, so like for example, if you were skewed out of the round because you couldn't check your opponent's evidence, so you don't know if they're lying, stuff like that means that they had an inherent advantage, and so the judge should just vote against them for like creating that imbalance in the debate. I know someone asked in chat about the difference between standards and voters. I'll get to that right after I finish this like slide, just because like I
And then to talk about no RVIs, what an RVI is, it's very often misinterpreted in public forum as to what an RVI is. And what an RVI is saying, right, is if you win defense on the shell, you lose the round. It's like weird. I don't know how I feel about RVIs. Salman, do you want to talk about it a little more?
yeah. So RBIs is like what Maeve said, like if you win a reason as to why their warranting on the shell is wrong, they should lose the round. RBI stands for like reverse voting issue. So it's like kind of like like the theory goes the other way. People read warrants for people read warrants as to like why our RVIs are good or bad. People read like RVIs are bad because it means like people will just bait bad practices. So like if you're a really good team and you know how to respond to theory super well, if the opponents are if you're are like allowed RVIs, you can just like not disclose, you can lie about all your evidence. And then if your opponent who's like maybe less good at debate than you tries to read theory, you can just like dump a bunch of defense on the shell. And then if you win the shell, you win because you baited bad practices and then won the RVIs. Um, and stuff like that. Other people read like RVIs are good because it discourages debaters from reading Friv theory. Um, so like like Friv theory is like theory that's like not really like actually about abuse in the round, but rather like opponents trying to like dump a bunch of like real like smaller theory shells and stuff like that. And so people say like that's uneducational, and if they lose for losing one of these shells, it discourages people from like reading a bunch of like frivolous shells. Do you want to talk about counter interps?
Yeah. So a counter interp, it's usually a little shorter than an interp, but it's essentially how you respond to shells. Because a lot of people will say reasonability over counter interps, like, oh, this is unreasonable. You shouldn't expect us to disclose and cut every card perfectly. But that's kind of silly because it's kind of arbitrary what it means to be reasonable and like what your judge is going to think. And so people always say prefer counter interps because otherwise it just collapses to reasonability, or reasonability collapses to counter interpretations, because if you're reasonable, then there should be a reasonable counter interpretation as to what you should be doing, which I'm not sure if that's making much sense, but it's essentially just you have to present your different way of viewing the world. And a lot of people get scared off by counter interpretations because it's like, OMG, I don't have a written out counter interp. What am I to do? But it's really simple to read. And essentially, like if someone says, oh, you should disclose, you can just say, oh, debaters shouldn't disclose. And I think the smartest way to read counterinterps is explaining why you meet their standards. So if they read a standard on clash, say, oh, not disclosing allows us to have more clash because you're forced to think on the spot, and that's better for education, or blah, 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 so on and so forth. But there's also something called defensive counterinterpretations, and so I think these can be a little bit better, where essentially if someone says something, you can read a counterinterpretation with a reason to drop them for either A, like reading the shell, or B, promoting a bad practice. And so those are a little more dangerous because most counterinterpretations are defensive, just like, oh, we meet their standards, it solves for this, this, and this. Like, there's no education difference because we're educational too. But then offensive counterinterps, those are a little more like sharp, I'd say. Salman, do you have anything to add?
Oh no, I was just gonna answer the person stuff about standards and voters now.
Oh, also really quick, for the person that said in theory, but what speech did I run theory, you always want to read it right after the violation occurs. So if you're reading like disclosure, round reports, or anything related to the wiki, you should read it in your first speech because you already had the chance to contact them and there's no reason to wait for rebuttal. And so usually instead of reading like a 4 minute constructive, you can read your shell and then maybe like two contentions. But generally in round, if it's something that happens in round, like a trigger warning violation, you want to read it in the speech after the violation occurs, and so that you have like the maximum time to engage with the shell.
Yeah. So just for the person about like standards and voters, so standards are like kind of like why your theory is good. Like in a disclosure round, it's like why disclosure is good. In like a paraphrasing round, it would be like why paraphrasing is bad, and like all the warranting as to why your interpretation is true. Voters are like the essentially like the impact the judge is voting on. So like for education in a disclosure round, the judge would be voting for like your standard on like cross pollination or something to improve education. And so like education is like your voter, and standard like and cross pollination is your standard. Usually people have like a little bit of warranting in their voters as to like why like education as a voter is important. So example, like the only reason why schools fund debate is because it's an educational activity and stuff like that. So like to just like long story short, like voters are what your judge is voting on, and like standards are how they get there.
Mhm. Yeah. And so the next slide is talking about, oh, it's an example. Um, okay. So this is an example shell in round. So what you would say if you're reading it, you would say probably one-off paraphrasing shell. Interpretation when evidence is introduced in round, it must be read as a full cut card, not paraphrased, with the exception of bracketed conjunction. I wouldn't read the shell. I don't think bracketed conjunction should be allowed personally. This is not my example. But then the violation would be they paraphrase. Like I previously said, this is not very specific. I wouldn't read this example specifically, but I would say they paraphrase their like Smith 21 evidence by changing it to say that like critiques are bad. Um,
This is
and
like really meta because that's that actually doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
And then you would say standards. See how the standards are long, guys? This is like what we want. You say first is evidence ethics. Paraphrasing reduces nuanced and in-depth evidence into biased two-sentence summaries, empirically proven by the widespread use of misconstrued evidence. Cards ensure tags are grounded in direct quotes and make it easier to check for misrepresentation, so on and so forth. And then you would read the other two, which is more research, which I think is a good one because paraphrasing encourages lazy research practices where teams only find mediocre evidence and then misconstrue it rather than reading more topic literature to find the best evidence. Probably true, probably good for education, which is what they're going to explain down here. And then prep skew, if we want to know the quote of their evidence, not only does it require us to use prep skew, well, they don't have to, but it also takes longer to read through the parts they paraphrased than our quotes. I think this is the best standard to go for on paraphrasing, quite honestly, because prep skew is just an in-round harm that it's kind of hard to like make up for and remedy. And so I just think like probably a good thing to go for because everyone's watching it happen. And then the voters vote on fairness. Abuse prevents objective evaluation of substance of the round, which is your intrinsic role as a judge. And education, it's why schools fund debate and the only long-lasting value. Um, so yeah, those would be the voters. And then this person reads drop the debater and says that a vote for us endorses a positive model of debate, wins and losses determine the direction of the activity, so on and so forth. I would also, in addition to this, I would read prefer competing interpretations and no RBIs, or the other two paradigm issues that I personally believe are very important and you should have on almost any shell you're reading. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Also, when you're collapsing your standards, make sure you also go for the voters that like match your standards. So like don't go for like just make your life easy and like don't go for prep skew, but then extend like education because like your this argument about prep skew is like inherently about the fairness in the round. And so like don't it like it's kind of hard to make that internal link into education. Whereas like stuff like research is very obvious about like how it literally says like this harms education because debaters like learn less about the topic. Um
Another really nitpicky thing, but certain judges will drop you if you don't read an internal link from your standard to your voter. And what that means is essentially you have to explain why more research is good for education, right? And so you would say when teams do more in-depth research, then they get better education, which is the only long-lasting value of debate. And just making that connection between the standard and the voter is really important, especially in high-tech rounds where some of the standards might be a little random, and you have to make that very, very explicit as to why you're impacting that.
Um, oh, okay. We could also just answer some questions people asked in chat. So on this stuff about like brackets to make it grammatically correct, like usually I in general think brackets are like probably not great for evidence. Like usually you can find a way to make stuff grammatically correct. Like if you need to add in a the, like I'm sure you could find the letter. Like sometimes like I'll do this and it'll like be really it's kind of funny as well. Like you can kind of like find the letters, but usually like even without doing it kind of slimily, like you can usually find a way to make the article grammatically correct and highlighting it. Um,
And like I said earlier in this lecture, it's not about what you do, it's about what you justify. And so even if it's just for grammatical reasons, I think justifying bracketing allows for wider abuses in debate and probably not a good thing.
okay, yeah. And then it's the stuff about like small schools. Um, so like first, I think this the argument about small schools is like not the best response to disclosure theory. Um, because like realistically, like if you're a very small school, the likelihood that like someone like Blake or like like Blake is gonna start like looking at your docs and prepping you out is like not um super likely. But like even if you like read um small schools and then like they say they're also a small school, you can kind of like bring up this argument of like it's not what you do, it's what you justify, right? Like the idea that small schools have to disclose all the time, even if you're a small school too, it like incentivizes a bad model of debate, where like like small schools who don't necessarily have as much research capability but yet we're able to find like niche arguments shouldn't be forced to disclose that because it puts them at a disadvantage. But generally like even with that I think the small schools warrant is probably not the best response to disclosure theory.
I low-key think disclosure is good for small schools. I think people should make more use of it because as me and Salman are the only PF team at our school kind of that like
Yes.
evidence, and we love the wiki. It's awesome. Like whenever people cut evidence, it's so much easier to go and like be able to take from the better arguments. And so as a small team, people don't usually steal our stuff. Like we're not really worried about that. Like no one
The
like
conflict
cares what
atonement.
we read. And so it's just like a lot easier to disclose and meet the norm than like combat disclosure theory. And then we can also like read disclosure theory, which is like good, you know? But okay. So we have some words of wisdom really quickly. So the first one is if you're going to read theory, please be nice. This is like really important. I hate when big teams just go and like beat down on small teams for not knowing like how to disclose or something and people are like uncool in a theory round. Because it's theory, it's about debate. Like we're trying to make a more inclusive space and when you're like mean about a norm, then no one wants to follow that norm. So I'd say please be nice. And then frivolous theory, we were talking about this earlier. And we did used to read a lot of the frivolous theory. Like we were really into reading like teams must say their favorite anime character because it helps us bond, or teams can't read evidence, or like sorry, did someone put something in chat? Oops. Oh, it was you, Salman.
Yeah, no, no, yeah. I'm just like, it's
But
whatever.
generally, like reading frivolous theory, it's questionable. Because like if you're debating a friend, I get it. Like it's chill, whatever. But I think like me and Salman used to read Friv theory when we didn't want to debate a hard team. And I think that's kind of bad because it's not good for education, honestly. But if you get like really good at frivolous theory, like that can be cool. But I think the other issue with frivolous theory is like the we meets. Like we meets are just so violent on it. Like I remember last year our teammates read stuffed animal theory and then one of their opponents got up and was like, "Oh, my mask is my stuffed animal." And I've heard like my partner is my stuffed animal. And so
I haven't heard that one.
you haven't heard that one? Okay, I have. But
No.
no, it's just it's very easy to say like we meet. And like there are some annoying ones, honestly, like put your favorite Spotify artist on your wiki. I think that one's annoying. But I think frivolous theory is probably bad for education, especially when it's read with like drop the debater. Like, why am I losing for not doing this very specific thing? And I think that argument's pretty easy to respond to on
Yeah.
the
I think Friv is like pretty bad, but I don't know.
the
My
30-second
takes.
theory. What do you
Um,
think of a 30-second theory?
what?
A theory shell that's like read in 30 seconds or like because I think there's a lot of teams that will read short theory shells just to like put it as a spike and be able to say like and then stake the round on it later just after like throwing it in as a blip. Um, I'm not sure what like the 30-second theory is. If you could explain more about it, I think that would be good. But or like why teams. Oh yeah, we actually read this last weekend. Um, but generally, I
Oh,
think
30 speaks theory. Okay.
pretty speaks theory is a frivolous shell. I think there are some good warrants for it. Like if you're just having like a really bad day and you want 30 speaks, like yeah, sure, like it's not harming anyone.
The warrant at Harvard was actually really like if any of you were at Harvard in PF, the warrant for 30 speaks theory was actually excellent because like just a little anecdote. So what happened at Harvard is like there was a snowstorm and so like they like delayed the tournament and so they essentially canceled quadruple octafinals. And so what that means is that like 70% of the 4-2s didn't break. And so like the uniqueness for the argument for it was actually really good because it was like if you like speaks matter more than ever. And so sometimes 30 speaks theory actually there's like some good warrants for it. Most judges, especially like older school and like more like head coaches, like some like college students will like it more, but like if they're like a coach at a school, usually like they're not gonna buy it. On stuff like about like the best responses to frivolous theory, usually like usually like the best responses to frivolous theory are like just the most intuitive. Like just like take some prep time, like think through the argument like intuitively, um, and like oftentimes you'll end up at the right response. Um, you can also just go like for theory bad. Like this is kind of like what we were talking about before with like offensive counter interpretation, just being like for theory is bad for debate turns in-depth discussions about like real life issues into like silly like like nothingness that people don't gain any actual education from. So like just make intuitive responses, stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah. And so our hot takes are that paraphrasing is low key good.
These are not my hot takes. These are Maeve's hot takes, guys. Oh
Because
no,
I
paraphrasing good. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Paraphrasing is bad. I thought. Oh no, no, no. Wait, sorry, I'm tweaking. Guys, I think paraphrasing is bad. I think paraphrasing is bad.
I think paraphrasing can be a good skill to learn if you do it well, because like you're gonna need to paraphrase in real life, you know? And at heart, I do believe that disclosure is bad. This is something I'll admit because I think like yeah, it's probably bad for argument generation and like critical thinking. Um, but like I love stealing off the wiki, and so I always like I'll disclose because it's good. I love cross-pollination. So yeah, those are my three hot takes. Feel
Those are
free.
Maeve's hot takes.
Oh, Lydia has
Oh,
a.
wait, yo,
You can unmute if you would like.
you can unmute if you want.
So we have a rule that our captain said that we're not allowed to disclose on the wiki. So then what do we do when someone runs disclosure on us? Because then, like, I'm not sure like how to respond to that because our captains were just like, just run small school theory, you're fine. And then we were like, okay. And then we ran that and our opponent's like, so we're actually small school too. So like you don't have an excuse. And I'm like, well, we do, but I don't know how to say that. Is that like something I can do in round?
That is something you can do in round. There's this team Regis, and I know they read this every single time they get discipline around them, which is like 5 times a tournament. They'll just be like, because their coaches will kick them off the team if they lose and like if they like disclose on the wiki. And so I think it's fair to say that like we can't like literally at our school, it's our school policy. And then you can probably, if I was you, I would make a warrant about how like not being able to be in debate is actually worse for education because you can read disclosure in every round and the unique harm of like me not disclosing one round is significantly less, is like, even if we don't disclose this one round, that only harms like a little bit of in-round education for you. Whereas if we get kicked off of our team and aren't able to debate at all, that is much worse for the space than me not disclosing. Like that's the response I would make probably. Because like if it's actually something your like captain could punish you for or like doesn't let you do, then there's probably like repercussions. And that's probably like worse for you and your education than like not disclosing one round, like in my opinion. And so that's why I think like that's what I would say.
Also, separate thing, like just try and convince your captains. Like
Yeah.
it's probably also like for it's probably not worth it. It's like if you're debating on the circuit a lot, it's probably just not worth it to like lose rounds because you're losing to disclosure theory or like stuff like that. Rather than just like disclose, especially if you are a small school, like the harm to disclosing is like actually like not that much. Like people aren't really stealing your docs.
And then how often is theory used in varsity rounds? I'd say it depends on what type of varsity rounds you're debating because on the national circuit, I'd say it's a pretty frequent thing. But if you're like on varsity at a local circuit, like you're probably fine. But mostly at like TOC bid distributing tournaments, you'll see more theory.
Depends on the tournament as
Yeah.
well.
And it
Like
also depends on like who. Because in out rounds, you'll probably see a lot more theory, but like in prelims, like I know we will not read theory on teams that like don't have like a wiki. I know a lot of other teams are probably like that too. And so it just depends.
oh yeah. Also, words of wisdom. Um, if you're like uh good, if you're like a very good team, like and you're like hitting novices and it's like a tech judge, like
Don't do that.
really like there's no need. Because oftentimes and I this is one of my like this is my take. Like I think, and I know maybe talked about this earlier as well. Like people use theory as a crutch when they want to jettison like rounds that they just aren't like, oh, I don't really want to debate. Like like you went to the tournament, like you should debate rather than have a silly round, especially if they're novices and like they won't know how to respond and like you're gonna beat them anyways. There's no point to have like a round that they're probably not gaining that much from um because like like just beating up these random novices probably won't make them actually learn how to respond to theory all that well.
Mhm. Yeah. And then countries that believe paraphrasing is bad.
Oh wait,
Look at this
yo,
map.
I don't even know what this is about.
Really educational.
Really educational. So like I guess this is the Q&A. Does anyone have any like?
I'm responding to shells still. We
Oh
have
wait, responding sales. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe you want to talk.
oh, we can send the link to the slideshow in a second. But responding to shells first, we already talked about counter interpretations, just saying like counter interpretation, blah blah blah. This should be the rule as opposed to what they said. I think we meets are my favorite way to respond to theory. I know there's this team Nueva CG that read like one really funny round on disclose all evidence theory. They notoriously said they were Blake and that the reason they couldn't see that they disclosed all evidence was because they disclosed under Blake. And they won on this argument for the record because
Didn't win.
sometimes
Sorry.
they didn't.
No,
Oh, they won the round,
they
so
did win the round.
matters. But like I think we meets can be really funny and throw your opponents off. If you like, I think funny we meets are good. Turns. Salman, do you want to talk about turns?
Yeah. So turns. So like turns can kind of come in a couple forms. The most like obvious turns are gonna be like on the offensive counter inter, essentially like saying if your opponent says disclosure is good, the offensive counter inter is being like, no, disclosure is bad. Teams should not disclose, and each standard is essentially a turn um on the original interpretation. I think I'm pretty sure you like people also read turns on the line by line, like essentially just like going down your opponent's flow, like going down your opponent's shell and saying like, no, this like just like this is actually bad for like education and such like that. So most of the time turns will be in the offensive counter inter.
Yeah. And then another big tip is just like line by lining. I know shells can be really scary when people read them on you. Yeah. Honestly, just like line by lining and saying, oh, you say that we should disclose because it's good for education, but like it's worse for education because blah, blah, blah. Like disclosure is bad. It just lets people attack your arguments, lets big schools prep you out. And then just being logical because honestly, like a lot of the standards can be silly. And honestly, if someone reads like a standard like library and they're like, you can kind of just get up there and be like, we're not doing any original prep. No one's like looking at our thing for in 7 years to look at the library standard. But a good quote on theory generally is that if you never want to debate theory, meet every interp, to quote Benjamin Miares. But I'd say that's probably true. That's why we disclose because we don't really want to have a round where it's like, oh, you don't disclose round reports, you lose. Like that's just no fun. And so if you just like don't want to debate theory, just
Yeah,
ethically and
good
like
norms.
evidence ethics.
Also, kind of with what Maeve said about like using logic, like this is something I believe wholeheartedly. An argument is an argument. There's no argument that's like scary. There's only arguments you haven't learned to respond to yet. Like every single argument ever has a claim, a warrant, and an impact. Just like break it down. If you don't, if you can't understand it in its whole, break it down into its parts. Attack each individual link. Like theory is just like any other argument. It's just rather than being about the resolution, it's about the debate itself. So yeah. Lydia.
Yeah, we're gonna do a quick little Q&A just to end this presentation. So if anyone has any lingering questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute.
I wanted to ask, can you run theory on people for bad evidence sharing? Like, if we disclose, for example, like on my outside of school team, when we do disclose, we like disclose like everything, right? But then when we go against people who disclose, like they just give you a doc and it's just all cards. It's like not cut, not highlighted. It's all one big font. You can barely tell which card is distinguished. Can you run theory for that?
Yes, I fully understand this because that's something called full texting versus open sourcing, and people disclose horribly, and you can run theory for this. There are actually a ton of shells on the wiki about why open sourcing is better than full texting, and I know Strig Jesuit GZ, shout out them, they won the TOC. They used to full text everything, and they would just like bait this, and they would respond to it so well, and they'd be like, guys, full texting is good. Because then you have to like cut it yourself, but you still get like all the evidence. I think that's silly. But generally, like, yes, you can read theory for that because I think it's super abusive. And I think generally what you can say is teams should have to open source disclose. Like, this is what our disclosure interp says. Um, but yeah, no. Having to open source as opposed to full text, like, you can just read reasons full texting is bad. Like, you can't actually know what you're saying. It makes it harder. It's the same thing where there's prep skew and you actually have to, like, look through all of it. But yeah, no, for sure. And then the next question is, Salman, do you want to do that?
Yeah. So we meets are essentially saying like it's like what the phrase says. It's like if your opponent said like you should disclose and like on the wiki under the school name. A we meet is essentially saying like we met your interpretation. So like usually in disclosure it's pretty clean cut as like if the team did or did not disclose. Um but in like other rounds as to like like certain evidence abuses and stuff like that, you can read we needs as to like the text of the interpretation didn't accurately describe what you did. Um so then also like on counter interpretations. Counter interpretations are just essentially like another way of thinking about debate. So like if the interpretation is that teams should like should disclose like all their evidence on the wiki. A counter interpretation to this would be like teams should disclose if their opponents ask them to like via email. So like and like then on the counter interpretation you would explain as to why this solves their standards as well. So like I yeah, so like a counter interpretation is like another model of debate that also solves all of your opponent's stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
and then you asked a question about strat skew, and that is different from prep skew because prep skew just says that we have to use more prep time looking at this, and we're not going to have the same prep time. But strat skew is a little different insofar as, yes, it is skewing you in a different direction, similar to prep skew, but what it does is it skews your strategy. And so you can say, oh, if you don't disclose, then we don't know how to like properly respond to your arguments. Like maybe we would have read like a framework or something, and generally that it skews how you respond to their arguments. But I think strat skew does tend to exist more on shells that are like trigger warnings or paraphrasing, because then you have to like to actually change your responses and change like how you are able to interact in the round and like what your strategy is. And so I'd say that is the bigger area where you'll see strat skew as a standard.
cool.
Mhm.
Any
Any more questions? I also sent the link to the slideshow. Don't mind that it is a like slides go template and I didn't delete the rest of the slides. But yeah, no, all the information is generally there. Does anyone else have any questions? Or are we good? Just stop screen sharing.
Wait, I have a question. So do you guys go to like a coach outside of school, or are you guys just done this on your own, or like
Yeah,
because you guys are also from like a smaller school with not as many resources. That's why.
yeah. We do go to a school. We go to a private school, and so they do hire a coach for us, which is pretty nice, I would say. Shout out them.
shout
But I
out
don't
Elijah
know
Smith. I go.
Elijah Smith. But generally, I know a lot of small schools that do not have a coach and generally kind of just have to go to coaches outside of school. But I would say that one of my biggest pieces of advice for small schools in debate is to get connections. I know that when we were a small school, we used to like not have really a coach that was involved, and we would cut all of our evidence on our own. We would like write all of our own cases, and it was just so work intensive. And so one of the things that I think changed that for me was getting connected in debate and like making friends and like joining a prep group, which is a little harder to do. But generally, I would say like, yes, you don't need a coach though, is my take on it. Because the wiki exists and there are so many different like lectures and resources and people who like if you just talk to them, they're willing to like help explain things to you. That I think while having a coach is useful and it is helpful, there is a way to debate without like paying for a coach and spending a lot of money on it.
Yeah. Also, there's like a plethora of videos online. Like literally like I'm sure there's like 10 if not more other lectures on theory debate from like other people online that exist, and this is like true for almost like every single argument, like just like general case structure to like answering critiques to like specific critiques that if you want to read there's a lecture for, and like all of this stuff. So like if like look on YouTube, there's like so many lectures on there. Um, usually they're given by people who are really experienced. So yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?